Sonny Melendrez, Sonny Radio, SonnyRadio.com.
Hello, hello. It's Sonny Melendrez, and welcome to the positive side of the radio spectrum. You have found the Sonny Melendrez Show. Every week we strive to bring you entertainment and inspiration through storytelling, fascinating guests, exclusive celebrity interviews, and it's all delivered with lots of enthusiasm. Can't wait to introduce you to my special guest today. His name is Gavin Edwards, and I love the title of his book, Kindness and Wonder: Why Mr. Rogers Matters More Now Than Ever. You'll meet Gavin in just a bit. We are brought to you by Ideal Precision Roofing. As you know, Ideal Precision Roofing is the premier roofing company in San Antonio. They've done hundreds and hundreds of roofs, and every time I speak to a homeowner who has had their roof done by Ideal Precision Roofing, one of the things they tell me is that they can't believe how easy the process was. Many times it's because of hail damage. They found Ideal Precision, usually because a neighbor had had their roof replaced by Ideal Precision and had a great experience. They call Ideal, and an expert comes out, assesses the damage, contacts the insurance company. The whole process gets going in a matter of just a few days, if not faster. And before you know it, the crew is on the roof. They do the job, they leave, and it's like they were never even there. But the one thing that they always say is that they were kept abreast of every step of the process all along the way. Ideal Precision Roofing. If you suspect you might have hail damage, if you're needing a new roof, please give them a call at 210-485-1553. That's 210-485-1553, or visit them at idealprecisionroofing.com and tell them that Sonny Melendrez sent you. And now, on with the show.
Sonny Radio, SonnyRadio.com, San Antonio.
Well, my guest today is the New York Times best-selling author of 11 books, including his latest, Kindness and Wonder: Why Mr. Rogers Matters More Now Than Ever. Gavin Edwards, welcome to the show. And I have to start out by telling you a little story. In the 1970s, I was on the air. I had a radio show on KMPC, which is a big personality station in Los Angeles. And I got a call from a producer. They said, we have a show called Old Friends, New Friends, and we want to do an interview with a comedian. We want to shoot a segment where he's being interviewed on the radio. He's an up-and-coming comedian. And so they would take any profession, and they take somebody who's well-known in that profession or very successful, and someone who's just starting. So they had Milton Berle, who was, of course, the legend, and then they had this young comedian named Joey Restivo. And they asked me if I would interview him. And I said, absolutely. So I'm in the studio preparing for the interview. I get the call from the front desk saying, your guest has arrived. And I said, so, okay, great. So I go, I meet the comedian, I meet the other person that I've been talking to, and then they said, and here's the host of the show, and it's Fred Rogers.
So they gave you no warning.
Yeah. And I'm standing there, I'm looking at him, I'm going, Mr. Rogers! Oh my God! I can't believe it. I mean, it was unbelievable. So we go and we do the interview with the comedian, and Mr. Rogers, of course, is sitting in the room there. And then I asked him, I said, "Would you mind interviewing?" So I talked to the comedian probably for like 10, 15 minutes. I talked to Mr. Rogers for an hour and a half. and I tell you, Gavin, it was unbelievable. He did all the voices. He told the stories. I mean, it was just phenomenal. And in fact, because he stayed with me, I gave him a ride back to his hotel.
Oh my God!
And this is what I think you'll really appreciate. So we go, and I had a little a Porsche coupe, and you can see I'm in this Porsche with Mr. Rogers, right? But before we got into the car, it's a two-seater. Before we got in the car, he says, "I was wondering, would you mind if I took your picture?" And pulled out his little camera and took my picture. And I thought it was odd because this is before selfies and everything else. You know, I wasn't, it's not like we all had cameras with us all the time. And I thought it was odd that he would take my picture, you know, and I should be the one saying, can I take your picture or can I have a picture with you? But anyway, like 3 weeks later, I get a card in the mail, a personalized note saying it was great to meet you. And he mentioned something that we had talked about. And then in the card was the picture he had taken of me.
That's amazing. Did you find, when you were speaking with him, that he was much more interested in asking about you than he was in speaking about himself?
Absolutely. And that is why your book just spoke to me. I mean, all these stories about how interested he was in other people and how it brought him so much joy, don't you think?
Absolutely. And that, sort of, it's obviously like manifested in the show. You can see sort of like the caring he has for, sort of thousands, millions of children that he's never met. But sort of it was, I did not realize until I started working on the book, like how that also, he expressed that like in just his everyday interactions. If he was with somebody for any reason, he wanted to know about them.
He did.
He cared about them. He wanted to communicate with them. He was going to find a way to speak to them in their language. And it's been a really powerful reminder to me that, sort of, I can't do it all the time because I'm not Fred Rogers, but I try to do it as much as I can.
Oh, yeah. It is so inspiring. And he, basically, he was going to be a Presbyterian minister, which he was, but in college, his two majors were music and French, weren't they?
Yeah, he had a music major, and he also studied French a lot. I think he switched from French to music. And he had considered going into the seminary, and then he he was, like many people, he had all these talents, and he didn't know what to do with them. He learned to be a pilot. He thought, maybe I'll do that. He thought, maybe I'll go into the diplomatic corps. He said, maybe I'll work with children. He had done all this puppetry when he was younger, and he had put that away. And it's astonishing that he sort of was the perfect man at the perfect time. That as TV started, he was able to make a show that let him use all those talents of his, even though he couldn't have imagined it even a few years earlier.
Yes. In fact, he even wrote an opera about the short. I love the topic. It was a short-necked giraffe, right?
Yes, Josephine, the short-necked giraffe.
And it was in French.
Yes, and he wrote it in college, and then he put it aside for like 30 years, and he did other sort of like musical episodes of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. But before the show ended, he sort of pulled out Josephine, and I think it was the last one he ever did on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Wow.
So it all came full circle.
That is amazing, and how he got into television, especially children's programming, was really interesting, wasn't it? Because television was just starting out around the time that he was leaving college, wasn't it?
Right. So his family had a TV set, which was sort of an expensive novelty at the time, but he came from money in the town of Latrobe, Pennsylvania, which is just a little bit outside Pittsburgh. And he comes home from school, and he turns it on, and he's fascinated. But it's kind of like it's the new gadget. It's like a new smartphone or like the new PlayStation might be today. But he's also a little horrified. He turns it on in the afternoon, and he watches some of the children's programming, which is what he was curious about. And he said, like, oh, they're putting pies in each other's faces. Like, it was just sort of slapstick. But he's like, well, this is like squandering the potential of this amazing medium. And it's astonishing to me that, like, in that moment, he both had like the moral clarity to know what he wanted to do and to say, like, well, not that style. And he also just recognized the amazing power of the medium and said, I can do something with this. And, sort of like dropped going to the seminary and said, I want to go do this. And like went to New York to work for NBC for a few years.
Tell us about his relationship with Gabby Hayes, of all people. And tell us, for the benefit of our young listeners, tell us who Gabby Hayes is.
Gabby Hayes was another. Oh, I'm sorry. Gabby Hayes is the character actor who sort of was often the old like codger in John Wayne movies. So if the guy like living out in the sticks, sort of like whittling and like maybe sort of spitting some tobacco.
Yeah.
So Fred Rogers, young man, goes to New York. He's working as a floor manager at NBC. He's like learning the ropes of the business. He works with sort of like NBC had an opera company that did things in that era. He also sort of helped with the first experiments of color TV, even though he was himself colorblind. And there was one show where Gabby Hayes introduced old westerns. It was just like, hey kids, here's a western movie, and like your pal Gabby will tell you about it. And one day, sort of young, like, staff assistant asks him, hey, Mr. Hayes, like, when you're looking to the camera, what do you think about? And he holds up a finger and says, I just think of one little buckaroo. And it files that away, and, sort of like, well, that's, interesting. But years later, when he was doing his own show, and when he was on camera for the first time, he remembered that. And you can see that, he sort of very much has that connection with people when they're watching. But even the way he refers to the audience, he doesn't say, all of you out there in TV land.
Right.
Or, he would always say, my friend. And, he made each individual child watching the show feel like they were his friend, they were his neighbor, and that, it felt like for anyone watching it, that it was a one-on-one connection.
Yes, absolutely. And, that same advice applies to radio. And something that I've always done all my life. Instead of saying everybody, you're talking to one person. So the idea of the show really kind of evolved, and the people who worked on the show were they were such disciples of him.
Yes.
And I saw a quote that said that we couldn't leave the show, and I forget who said it, but she said we couldn't leave the show because if you're yellow in one of Van Gogh's paintings, you can't go. You can't leave.
That's right. That was Betty Averlin, who played Lady Averlin, said that.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think it's just such a lovely thing of everyone who's working on it, like, sort of, like, recognize they're part of, like, a larger vision, and, sort of, sometimes they were happier with the job than other times, but, sort of, like, it was, you just had to respect, they were part of something bigger than themselves.
Absolutely. And you talk about the fact that he was a floor manager or working on a crew in New York, and that's how he met Gabby Hayes. There were people who worked on his crew that went on to a bigger position in show business, and one of them was somebody named Michael Douglas.
Right, who had to change his name because there was both the actor Mike Douglas and the TV host Mike Douglas, and so people will know him better as Michael Keaton. And Michael Keaton was sort of like young man, like in Pittsburgh, trying to get his foot in the door in show business, and so he worked on the show for a couple of years. He said that he sometimes would put on like the purple panda suit. So I don't think he ever appeared on camera with his face visible, but he was occasionally on camera, like in costume.
Amazing, just amazing when you think about that. And the crew also played a lot of different tricks on Mr. Rogers, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, sort of everyone worked for him really, really loved him, and sort of like it was amazing to talk with people who were there, and sort of like the crew was like. Some of them, were sort of like long-haired hippies, and sort of like people say, oh, like there's smelling, sort of various fragrances, but they just got along famously. Like Fred enjoyed their company. One of them, Nick Tallow, would say that sometimes he'd like tell like Fred a dirty joke, and like. And Fred would laugh, and he wouldn't want to repeat it himself, but he'd call other people over and say, like, Nicky, tell the joke again.
And you also had people that you talked to that remembered fondly about being on the show as celebrities, like Rita Moreno.
Rita Moreno was my favorite person I spoke with for this entire book. And I mean, she's a treasure. She's a national wonder, and she is, even at her advanced age, is like sharp as a tack. And she was on the show at the same. She came on as a guest at the time. She was starring on The Electric Company, also on PBS. And they had wanted to show, sort of like a family that does different things. And her husband was a medical doctor. So she comes on, she sings one of Mr. Rogers' songs, It's You I Like, and she does it very sweetly, very beautifully. And she says afterwards, I was like singing to our friend. She looks in the camera and she makes that same connection that Fred Rogers does. And her husband goes through the black bag. Here's all of like my stuff. Like if you go to a doctor, this is what you're going to see, which is something that Fred Rogers was always trying to demystify for children. That they knew, they wanted to know in advance. It wasn't as scary if you told them about things. And so much of his show is an expression of that care. Like, I will show you the world, so it's like a little less intimidating. And they also brought along their daughter. And their daughter was a big fan, but she was very shy. And so she spent, sort of like the entire appearance, just kind of like clinging to Rita's leg. And at the end, Fred says to her, would you like to feed the fish? And she nods, and like they go over and they feed the fish. And then when they leave, he looks into the camera and says, did you see that she was very shy? And did you see that her parents love her very much anyway? And Rita said, decades later, she was still so moved by that he sort of like was so sensitive to her daughter's, sort of shyness and made her feel included, and in a completely unplanned way, like also use that as a way for like shy and awkward children who are watching to sort of like feel more comfortable in their own skin.
Powerful.
So it was lovely.
It really is, really is. And let me also just mention that I hosted a children's show myself for the Disney Channel. In fact, that was the first.
I feel like I should be interviewing you.
No. I don't want to usurp your time, but I just wanted to let you know where I'm coming from, because we did 120 episodes, and at the end of each episode, I would just talk to the camera about something that we had done that day. Which is just an inkling, kind of and I'm sure that much of the inspiration that I've gotten throughout the years has been from Mr. Rogers, and certainly the way that he has brought his wonderful joie de vivre and caring for others to the screen and touched so many of us. All right, I'm sorry.
I mean, he was great friends, you may know, with Bob Keeshan, who played Captain Kangaroo. And it was this lovely thing to discover that they had a tradition. Actually, it was around this time of year. Every year on New Year's Day, they would phone each other and catch up on the air. And it was just great that they recognized each other as kindred spirits, which he didn't feel that way about every TV children's host by any means, but he sensed like here's somebody else who's doing this because they care about children.
Yes, and of course Captain Kangaroo had Bunny Rabbit, which was also a puppet there, and he was also Clarabelle the Clown. What a great preparation that is. All right, we're going to take a break here, and when we come back, I want to talk about the second half of your book, which is the 10 ways to live more like Mr. Rogers today. We're proudly brought to you by Ideal Precision Roofing in San Antonio. Now, you've heard me say that Ideal Precision Roofing is an Owens Corning Platinum Preferred contractor. What exactly does that mean? Well, it's a distinction that puts Ideal in a very exclusive group of contractors. In fact, less than the top 1% of contractors carry the title of Platinum Preferred Contractor, as deemed nationally by Owens Corning. So what does that mean for you as a homeowner? It means that Ideal provides more exclusive benefits to all of our customers based on the status of our suppliers. In fact, the work that they perform on your home or building is guaranteed through the System Advantage Platinum Warranty, which backs workmanship for a lifetime. Not 5 years, not 10 years, but a lifetime. This is just one of the added benefits you'll get when you call Ideal Precision Roofing in San Antonio. 485-1553. That's 210-485-1553 for Ideal Precision Roofing. And don't forget to mention that you heard it on the Sonny Melendrez Show.
You're listening to the Sonny Melendrez Show. Sonny's email address is sonny@sonnyradio.com.
I'm back with Gavin Edwards, an unbelievable, wonderful tribute to Mr. Rogers. And I have to tell you that I know that he would be proud, Gavin, to know that you have penned Kindness and Wonder. I mean, just the title right there. Kindness and Wonder, Why Mr. Rogers Matters Now More Than Ever. Now,
thank you, Sonny.
Well, no, it's my pleasure because you speak my language, and certainly Mr. Rogers would definitely not only approve of this book, but he'd probably be interviewing you as well. So the 10 ways to live more like Mr. Rogers. I'm going to give you a few of my favorites, and I want you to kind of give us a little story because I love what you did. You didn't just list them. You actually apply a story about Mr. Rogers that really just kind of puts a big exclamation mark on these. And the first one is be deep and simple.
So that is like the foundation of what Mr. Rogers believed. That, sort of like he was always about, sort of like, he was this very smart, very educated guy, but who spoke in very simple language so other people could understand him. And I think it was not just a way of, sort of making sure he was communicating, but he found that exercise helped him focus his thoughts. And he said, like, the older he got, the more he believed that, like, the fundamental truth was that you should be deep and simple. He said, I think being deep and simple is so much more important than being shallow and complex. And I know from my own experience, like, we live in a shallow and complex era, right, Sonny?
We do.
Sort of like, we've always, there's tweets, there's our phones, there's emails, there's 700 distractions. Even without electronics, I find that I'm often like reading 6 books at once. I'll read 10 pages of one of them, and I'll skip over to the other for a while. It's very easy to get like distracted and have like a channel flipping ethos that applies to your entire life. And so this is actually the way to live that I have the most trouble applying to my own life. But I will say that when I do, I find it's the most rewarding. Sort of when I say, I'm going to slow down. I'm going to be in one place. I'm going to focus on the people I love who are around me. I'm going to work on one thing for, sort of like hours or days or weeks. And that is where I think, sort of you make those deeper connections and like the world blossoms for you. Like I know the people listening, everyone is distracted. They're probably listening while they're doing, sort of at least 2 other things at once.
Right.
Hopefully not driving and texting,
Yeah.
being 2 of them. But I would tell people that if you take even a moment every day and say, how can I apply this in my own life? You don't have to do it 100% of the time, but just like when you have a chance to catch your breath and focus and appreciate those who are around you and strip out some of the complexities, you will find it to be rewarding.
I agree. It very much is the power of now.
Yes, absolutely. Now and here, and the ones you love who are around you.
Yes, this moment. Make a joyful noise.
That's about music. That we talked about this a little before. That Fred Rogers' academic training was in music. When he was very young, he got his grandmother to buy him a piano, and he picked out Steinway Grand, and she swallowed hard and cut him a check. And he said that, sort of like music was like the heartbeat of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. And many of the people he cast on the show, he cast because he saw them performing music. Even if they did not regularly sing on the show, there was just sort of this like rhythm and this heartbeat, and he sort of like communicated with people that way. On the set, when he was, if he was unhappy with how things were going, he didn't like to sort of like, he wasn't obviously a screamer or a yeller. He didn't even like to be critical, but he would go over to the piano and he'd start playing, and his emotions would express themselves through the music. And so that means most of the time the music was joyful because he was a joyful person, and he was a big believer in the power of song to like uplift and unite people.
And there were so many subtleties, looking back now, and you bring them out in the book, about the way that he was teaching children. In fact, because of the age group, the 3, 4, 5-year-olds that he was programming to, everything, I didn't notice this until I read your book, everything was left to right, wasn't it?
Yes.
For a reason.
This was amazing to me. I went and in Pittsburgh, in the Heinz History Center, they have a lot of the original set. And I had never noticed when Fred Rogers walks in the door, it's the beginning of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, there is a staircase that he always comes down, going from left to right. That staircase also has a second one to the side. He could have at any moment come in and turned left and gone that way, and he didn't. Partially because he believed in keeping things simple, repeating things it was reassuring to his viewers. He's heading towards the sweaters to change them, but he consciously was also staging action on the show as often as possible, going from left to right. He moved left to right when he could. The trolley going to the neighborhood of make-believe is always going from left to right. And he did this because he said he did not believe in, drilling letters and numbers the way, say, Sesame Street did. But he said, I'm helping children get ready to read. It's just orienting them to, start inputting information in a left to right direction so that, when they start learning their letters, they already have this just as a habit.
Wow.
When he was in the seminary, he studied child development, and it was just the more he learned about it, the more he wanted to make sure that the language of the show was inclusive, that it was clear, that the people who sometimes wrote for him, he would edit, and they would just joke that, it was like translating it into Fred Ease, that, you would go through 8 steps until finally you had something that had the same general sentiment, but, was expressed in a way that was his own language.
Yes. Love your neighbors.
Well, that's obviously an expression that comes from the Bible, and you can see that his seminary training, he would never bring in, explicit, Bible verses, but the moral lessons, he distilled in a way that people can understand. I used that chapter as an opportunity to talk about some of the more surprising connections I found, which was that, interestingly, he had this parallel life to Andy Warhol. They sort of grew up around the same time in Pittsburgh, and then they both moved to New York around the same time. Andy obviously stayed in New York and became the king of surfaces in his art that, did better than almost anybody. That's just thinking about how, commercial packaging, is the metaphor for who we were in the 20th century. But, Fred Rogers was less interested in surface and more in the depth, and he came back home to Pittsburgh and explored that as deeply as he could.
There's no question about the fact that he learned so much from others, especially those who he admired, but also in unlikely places. In fact, you mentioned something in the book about when he and some of his friends went to this chapel because they wanted to see this priest or this pastor who was very inspiring that they had heard about, but they were surprised when he was not there.
Right. And so there was a substitute preacher. He was pinch hitting because the person he'd heard so many great things about was on vacation that week. And Fred is in seminary at the time, and the guy is he's old, he's wandering, and Fred's sitting there grinding his teeth, just kind of ticking off in his head all the ways it's violating the rules of what he's been taught of, how to deliver a good homily and a good sermon. And it ends, and he turns to his friends, ready to say, wasn't that awful? And she, has tears in her eyes, and she says, that was wonderful. He said exactly what I needed to hear. And he realized, he learned this important lesson that day, and it was that he hadn't heard it because he had come, he wasn't listening. That once he decided that, this guy is breaking the rules, he became focused on the medium and the expression of the message rather than the message itself. And whereas his friend came with an open heart, and she got what he was saying, even if it was inartfully expressed. So that was a huge foundational lesson for him, and it was that sort of you needed to try to connect any way you could, and and A, he needed to be open-hearted when he was communicating with people, but B, if people were not listening to him for whatever reason, he would have to find a different way. He would have to keep on switching and keep on connecting.
Gavin, did you find that as you set out to talk to all these people, and you talked to many, many who had worked with him and whose lives he had touched, that they were most eager to tell you about their experience with Mr. Rogers?
Anyone I spoke with who spent time with him, just they carried that around. And in many cases, it was just a simple encounter. The people who met him as a child, and he got down on one knee and he actually looked them in the eye, and they remembered that moment of real connection. Or people who worked on his staff, sort of helping him answer the mail, because he wrote back to every child who ever sent him a letter, and he couldn't do that single-handedly, but he was so he had. But he made sure that there was a personal letter, and he oversaw it all. And everyone just they carried a piece of him in their heart. And I, wasn't lucky enough to spend time with him, but the message through what he did and through them was deeply moving to me. And so I'm hoping that my book does a little of the same for other people, that even, not all of us got to spend time with Mr. Rogers, but all of us can learn from how he carried himself and how he approached the world.
Gavin, it certainly does that and more. And I cannot tell you how much I'm thrilled I am to have found you, but to meet you, and I hope to one day meet you in person.
I would like that a lot, Sonny. I come to Texas every now and then, so we'll see what we can do.
Please do, because I know that you are one of us. Kindness and wonder. Why Mr. Rogers matters now more than ever. Gavin Edwards, it is a pleasure, an honor, and I applaud your great success.
Thank you, Sonny, and thank you for everything that you do.
My pleasure. Thank you. Well, that's my visit with Gavin Edwards, and I can't say enough about how inspired I am by his tribute to Mr. Rogers. Kindness and wonder. Why Mr. Rogers matters now more than ever. You're going to find the link to Gavin's book, his website, his Twitter page, Facebook, and more by visiting sunnyradio.com/show. That's sunnyradio.com/show. And by the way, while you're there, subscribe to my podcast so you don't miss a single episode. Until next time, I'm Sonny Melendrez, and I'll leave you with Gavin's 10 ways to live more like Mr. Rogers today. 1. Be deep and simple. 2. Be kind to strangers. 3. Make a joyful noise. 4. Tell the truth. 5. Connect with other people every way you can. 6. Love your neighbors. 7. Find the light in the darkness. 8. Always see the very best in other people. 9. Accept the changing seasons. And 10. Share what you have learned all your life. Thank you, Gavin, and thank you, Mr. Rogers.
So in all that you do, in all of your life, I wish you the strength and the grace to make those choices which will allow you and your neighbor to become the best of whoever you are.